Good evening. This is Pastor Mark Shover from Faith United Methodist Church in Waynesboro, Pennsylvania. We're in the third week of Lent now, and we're continuing our study on the Gospel of John together, put together by Adam Hamilton. The title is John, the Gospel of Light and Life, and tonight we're focused on the signs. John's often called the Signs Gospel. Before we get into that briefly this evening, I did want to share a verse from the end of John's Gospel because it's important. He really gives us the reason for writing his Gospel. Verse 31 in the 20th chapter, he says, "But these are written so that you may continue to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing in him you will have life by the power of his name." I think that's important that we know why John took the trouble to produce this gospel for us. So I wanted to share that before we begin. We have a fancy word that we use for the first three gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We call them the Synoptic Gospels, and really that's just kind of a fancy word that just means they're similar. So John is different. People have noticed that for centuries and centuries, that John is quite a bit different than the other Gospels. And John really gives us deeper theological meaning to the stories and things that John includes in his Gospel. There's always at least two layers, and usually the top layer is what we kind of bump into first. And if we really want to see the deeper layer, the deeper message, that takes more work. That takes more study and prayer and reflection, but we're invited to do that, especially in John's Gospel, because John's like a good artist. You probably have seen paintings. Good artists can do that. They can kind of hide clues in their painting, and if we're not really paying attention and thinking, we may miss some of the message that artist is trying to portray in that work of art. And it's exactly the same with John's Gospel, especially in these signs that we're looking at tonight. Now, one of the challenges with that, it's very fun and interesting to consider the deeper meaning in this, but one of the challenges is because it's more subjective, we may not always agree with one another when we're trying to understand that. So I think it's important that we give each other some grace. That deeper meaning isn't going to be as obvious, and we may not always agree on that message that John's trying to communicate, but I think it's fun and helpful for us to explore, and that's what we're challenged to do as part of this study. The Signs Gospel really is chapters 2 through 12 in John's Gospel, and it covers 7 signs. It's suggested that 7 is significant because it's a biblical number that really represents completeness. So it's very likely not by accident that John includes 7 signs in his Gospel from chapters 2 to 12. We're only going to look at 2 of them tonight, briefly. The first sign and the 6th sign. And the first sign is in the 2nd chapter of John, and I'm only going to share a couple verses of this story. Chapter 2, verses 1 to 5. The next day, there was a wedding celebration in the village of Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples were also invited to the celebration. The wine supply ran out during the festivities, so Jesus' mother told him, "They have no more wine." And I'm going to stop there. There's more to the story. I'm sure many of you have heard it before. But, wedding banquets were big deals, just like they are today, only in Jesus' day, we're told that it wouldn't have been unusual for a wedding feast to last 7 days. Can you believe that? I can't imagine the cost of that. Of course, things were different in Jesus' day than they are now, but they were really a big deal. And keep in mind, Christians down through the ages have kind of debated whether the wine that's used in the New Testament was fermented or not. I think most people today, most scholars think it likely was. Keep in mind that water was not safe like it is today to drink. So one of the reasons why wine was so commonly used as a beverage is because in reality it was a safer beverage than water. Oftentimes in Jesus' day, And even though, I think most feel that it likely was fermented wine, the Bible also speaks many times against drunkenness. So, that's important too. Um, Christians differ on, their use of alcohol, and we have to respect one another in that. But I think we can universally agree that the Bible speaks strongly against that. So if we choose fermented wine to drink, other alcoholic beverages, we really need to be careful with that, and we need to be responsible. That's certainly necessary to be a Christ follower. It's interesting in this story that, John gives us minor details that he wouldn't have to. He mentions that they're stone jars, and when Jesus filled the empty wine vats water, they were filled to the brim. So there's little details like that that suggested have deeper meaning for us to reflect on and explore together. Wine throughout the scriptures kind of symbolizes joy and happiness. So certainly this points to the Eucharist or the Last Supper. In John's Gospel, remember, we don't have the Last Supper meal like we do in the Synoptic Gospels in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We really don't have that. So we're thinking that John gives us this miracle kind of to point to the Eucharist, and that's important too. Wine actually has 250 references, and most of them are positive. And it's important to note in this story, when Jesus changes the water into wine, it was described as really good wine. So would we expect anything less of Jesus in this miracle? That this wine would have been exceptionally good, and it was noticed by the guests. The second sign that I want to look at briefly tonight is from John 9, 1-3. And I'll just share that quickly with you. It's in chapter 9, verses 1-3. This is a popular story, a sign story in John's Gospel too. I'm sure you've heard it before. I'll just share the first 3 verses. As Jesus was walking along, he saw a man who had been blind from birth. Rabbi, his disciples asked him, "Why was this man born blind? Was it because of his own sins or his parents' sins?" "It was not because of his sins or his parents' sins," Jesus answered. "This happened so that the power of God could be seen in him." And I'm going to stop there, but there's certainly a lot more to the story. One of the noteworthy things about this sign, this miracle of the healing of the blind man, John devotes the whole chapter 9 to this one sign, this one story. And that's significant. If you consider that John uses only 12 chapters to cover Jesus' whole earthly ministry, and he devotes one full chapter to this miracle, it's strongly suggested to us that this was a very important miracle of John, and he included it for special reasons. So, we're challenged to read this and look at the little subtle details in it and explore and ponder what some of the deeper meaning in this story could be. Of course, the question of sin is brought out in this, and it was common in Jesus's day to think if a person had, a challenge, a physical challenge in their life, a health challenge, that it was often their own fault, that it was brought on by sin in their life. And of course, quickly, that's extinguished in the story. That's certainly not true. Part of this miracle, it's interesting that Jesus actually takes dust from the earth and makes kind of a mixture with his own saliva and puts it on the man's eyes. And it's suggested that kind of relates to the creation story, because if you remember, man was created first and out of the dust of the earth. So it's suggested that there could be a relationship there, that Jesus is kind of recreating the man or making his body more perfect in the original creation. That's an interesting detail that's in the story. It's also noted that water is very important to John, 29 times. And it shows up more in John's Gospel, 20 times more than all of the other synoptics combined. So water is an image that's very, very, very important to John. Now, in conclusion to this story, it's kind of interesting that this healing actually happened on the Sabbath, and if you remember the story, Jesus got in trouble for that by the religious leaders, and he was accused of sinning because he actually performed this. And the religious leaders actually asked the blind man after he was healed if Jesus was a sinner, and he answered kind of interestingly. This is found in verse 25 of the story. He said, I don't know if he was a sinner or not, but this I do know. He said, I was blind, but now I see. So it's kind of an interesting answer that the blind man gives to the religious leaders. But it's suggested to us that John puts this story in there, and it's emphasized so much. He dedicates so much of the gospel to this story because he wants us to see that we're really all blind. And really the irony in this story is that the people that are really blind wasn't really the blind man, but were the religious leaders in Jesus' day. Even though they had physical sight, there was a lot of truth and spiritual meaning that they couldn't see. So, it's strongly suggested to us that that's really the deeper meaning in this story. So if you want to read more, I invite you between now and the time that we get together again next week to read all of chapters 2 through 5. And again, just kind of challenge yourself to look for that deeper layer that John provides, those subtle clues, those little intimate details that he goes out of his way to include, and just, challenge yourself and ask yourself, what could be the deeper meaning that John's trying to convey to us? That's just an interesting thing we can do, especially with John's gospel. Join us next week. We'll be back next Wednesday, and we'll be looking next week in the I am sayings of Jesus, and that's another major topic throughout John's gospel. So we'll spend a few moments on that next week. So be sure to come back with us next week as we pick that up and look at that as we go into now the next week. We'll be into the 4th week of Lent already. So let's just close in a word of prayer together. Lord, we're just so thankful. We're thankful for Adam Hamilton, the Church of the Resurrection, making this study available to us that has really just touched many people around the world, and we're thankful that we can reflect on it during this Lenten season this year, and just allow this season to be a time, oh Lord, that we can just learn more of what it is that John is trying to communicate to us. So just keep us in your spirit, oh Lord. Watch over us until we can gather again, and you just keep us in this season of Lent, that Lent can be a special time for us, a time when we can, grow in some ways in our faith. And all God's people said,